Welcome back to the Burnett Breakdown, where I, Hunter Burnett, keep up with the news so that you don't have to. This week, I'm going to be talking about the Hunter Biden plea deal falling apart, new Trump indictment charges, and Israel's Supreme Court controversy. On Wednesday, a federal judge put on hold the proposed deal between Hunter Biden and the Justice Department. So the deal would have had Hunter Biden plead guilty to tax evasion charges going back a few years, and into a diversion program for lying on a federal gun form. So he would have pled guilty to the tax evasion charges and been served with a misdemeanor for that. And then the diversion program said that if he did not use drugs or alcohol for the next 2 years, then the prosecution would not bring charges for lying on that federal gun form. That was the original plea deal as it was reported. However, on Wednesday, when the two sides came to court, the deal fell apart pretty much in court. The two sides originally disagreed in court on what, if any, charges Hunter Biden could still face in the future. So, in other words, they disagreed on how much immunity did the deal provide Hunter Biden. So the judge in this case actually is the one that kind of started to raise some questions about the deal that led to this obvious disagreement between the two sides. So what happens in plea deals is you have these contracts, these deals that are signed, these agreements that are signed, and they just kind of is usually standard legal language that is used, right? They just use these phrases, these words, these sentences that all these agreements use because it's largely agreed on what they mean, right? The legal community agrees this is what this means, so there's no potential for disagreement about the meaning of deals. Well, apparently, this deal had changed some of the language, kind of that standard legal language. And when the judge started to raise questions about the changes, she started to raise questions originally about if the prosecutors still could charge Hunter Biden in the future with any charges. And the prosecutors said that there's still an ongoing investigation that could lead to Hunter facing charges under the Foreign Agents Registration Act. So that is the part of Hunter Biden's scandal or, misdeeds in the past where he was taking money from foreign entities and has to register with the federal government in order to do some of the stuff that he was doing. And so he didn't do that. And so he's being charged with that illegally taking money from foreign entities and kind of undue influence that is involved there. So according to the Hunter Biden team, they thought that this deal, and if you look at the language of the deal, they would have been right. This deal would have basically provided Hunter Biden with immunity from everything in the future. So this is kind of how much collusion here is happening, and how much is this simply incompetence. But the government either went with and kind of agreed with the Hunter Biden team to do this, to change this language and make this broad sweeping immunity, include that in the deal, and then got caught by the judge and essentially came out and said, well, no, we can still charge in the future, and there was that, and they couldn't, they got caught basically. You could think of it, you could look at it that way. Again, depends on how much benefit of the doubt you want to give the government and how much you want to blame on malice, how much you want to blame on incompetence. The other kind of interpretation way you can see this is the Hunter Biden team tried to sneak this stuff in, or not even sneak, just put this stuff in, and the government, the prosecution, didn't even notice. They didn't even notice that the language had been changed. They didn't even notice these sweeping immunity claims. And so either, again, you could think of it, you could see it as this is collusion. The two sides were trying to get Hunter Biden a sweetheart deal and get him out of all future trouble, or purely incompetence on the government's part for not noticing the language changes. So it's going to be left up to interpretation, and we will probably never know. I usually try to when dealing with the government, assume incompetence because the government is just incompetent at almost everything it does. But with all of that said, the one thing that is clear, I think, is that there needs to be a special prosecutor appointed to this case. At this point, it is just, with all of the potential for influence peddling and the administration colluding with the defense and Hunter Biden's team, the interest in protecting Joe Biden potential in what could be discovered if this was a full and thorough investigation, just because of the image of that, they need to appoint a special prosecutor. A special prosecutor would basically step outside of the chain of command and would have full independence to investigate thoroughly. Now, theoretically, they've already done that with this case. The prosecutor theoretically has that independence, and they're not dealing with it, and that actually could help explain why they didn't catch the language change, because they didn't have the same number of resources that they normally would. So he could be completely independent, but just for the sake of public perception, there needs to be a special prosecutor appointed to this case in order to make sure that there's no impropriety going on. Moving on Thursday, new charges were released against former President Donald Trump. So just a week full of sleazy stuff with our current party leaders. So these changes were part of an indictment that supersedes the previous indictment in the classified documents case. So remember, Trump has been indicted twice now, one for basically state crimes in New York. I said that case was rather frivolous. The second indictment was the classified documents case. This indictment these charges that were released on Thursday is part of that second indictment. So it's basically just an indictment that supersedes, that takes the place of that original indictment. And all the charges are the same. They've just added on charges and added on a new defendant in the case. So the original indictment in June charged Trump with 37 counts on 7 different charges, including willful retention of national defense information, withholding a record, false statements, and conspiracy to obstruct. So this is where Trump basically took all those classified documents and was told to give them back by NARA, the National Archives Record Association or Administration, whatever the acronym stands for there, was told to give them back, had to give them back, had classified documents, was improperly storing classified documents, mishandling them at his Mar-a-Lago resort. And so this indictment charges him with mishandling those documents and that classified information, but also, and probably worse, obstructing the investigation into and the retrieval of those classified documents. So this isn't like the government told Trump, hey, we think you may have classified documents, can you give those back? And Trump said, oh, my bad, I didn't mean to take them, and gave them back. He believed, or at least seemed to believe, that those documents were his and his private property. He could do whatever he wanted with them, and he went out of his way to make sure they didn't get the classified, all of the classified material. So, a couple of the charges that were added in this case, one of the extra charges brought forth involved the military plans that Trump allegedly had a conversation about in the first indictment. So that first indictment, there was a section where they have this conversation, they record this conversation between Trump and discussing military plans for which you can speculate is Iran. Having this conversation about here's what we would have done, right? Here's what some people suggested we do, just laying out in detail and acknowledging in that conversation that this material was classified. So this is a really important conversation because it's Trump acknowledging that he knew this was classified material. It wasn't ignorant. Okay, so he knew this was classified material. He says this is classified. I could have declassified it as president, but now I can't. So now he's in this conversation also acknowledging that he doesn't have the power anymore to declassify it. And that's important because one of the defenses for Trump in this case was that as president, and even as former president, he still has the power, because he was president when these documents were classified, that he still has the power to declassify them. Or that as president, he declassified everything and just had a standing declassification of everything he takes to Mar-a-Lago. This conversation blows that out of the water. But the issue in the indictment is that this conversation was recorded, but the material, the documents that they were discussed, the classified information, wasn't included on the indictment. And so one of the Trump defense came out and said, basically, if this is so damning to the indictment and to Trump, then where's the document? Well, that document has now been, that classified document has now been added to this case. And two more charges or counts of obstruction were added. These claim that Trump and his associate attempted to, quote, alter, destroy, mutilate, and conceal evidence and tried to persuade someone else to do so by pressuring them to delete security footage. So, according to the indictment, Trump had a 24-minute phone call with one of his employees the day after the Trump organization received a grand jury subpoena draft requiring the footage, the security footage at Mar-a-Lago, to be turned over. And the importance of the security footage is that if it's true, and if the government is claiming that Trump moved and had the classified material moved so that it could not be retrieved by people coming to retrieve it, that security footage of showing them moving the boxes is going to be pretty important. So they send out the grand jury subpoena draft requiring the footage to be turned over. Well, the day after that indictment or that draft was sent over, there's this 24-minute conversation between Trump and his associate, one of the other defendants on this case. A few days after that conversation happened, that employee approached the IT director at Mar-a-Lago and told the IT director that, quote, the boss wanted the footage deleted. And that IT director essentially responded with, I don't know how to do that. I don't think I have the right to do that. And then the indictment doesn't actually claim that it was deleted. So it seems like they still have that security footage. But nonetheless, the intent, and Jack Smith, the prosecutor in this case, is making the argument that the intent was to delete that security footage. So there was an intent to obstruct justice, which is also a crime. Now, one question to kind of think about and consider, and this really raises, is why would Jack Smith bring more indictments now that weren't included on the first indictment, even though all occurred at the same time, right? So all of these alleged crimes that Trump committed occurred pretty much in the same time period. None of them have occurred since the last indictment came out. None of them, and some of them, you would think they already knew. So like the classified document, they knew that conversation had happened. So why add the classified document now? Why not just include all this in the first indictment? So the most likely theory for why not include these on the first one, but including them in the second one, the one that supersedes it. So this is according to Sarah Isgur on the Advisory Opinions podcast. The prosecutor likely, according to Isgur, got permission to include the extra classified document, so that the military plans essentially got permission from the agency whose document that was. That originally they didn't have permission to include that on the indictment, probably because there's 30 other charges based on it. So it wasn't needed to charge Trump because they had so many other documents to use. But then when the Trump team came out and basically said, well, where's the document? Then the agency who has basically owns the classified information, gave permission then for the prosecution to use it. So that's the theory about why to add that indictment to add that charge to this indictment. And then in terms of the other two, why they have been added since the last indictment is likely because of a new cooperating witness. That they were able either to, they found new information because they have a new cooperating witness, or they were able to confirm and affirm the information that they already knew because of this new cooperating witness. So this whole ordeal, as I said back when it was first released, does not look good for Trump. If the evidence that the indictment claims that the prosecution has is presented in court as it is described in this indictment, then Donald Trump is in trouble and should be in trouble, as I said at the time. This is really bad stuff, and he has every right to be charged and convicted and go to prison if this evidence is presented in court and is convincing. Moving on to Israel. So there's been a lot going on in Israel the last few weeks, a lot of protests. Hundreds of thousands of protesters have taken to the streets in Israel, in Tel Aviv, and Jerusalem, basically over this disagreement about the Supreme Court in Israel. So Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, has been proposing legislation to curb the power of the Supreme Court in Israel. So a couple of things before I get to what happened this week to know about the Supreme Court in Israel. So Israel in general does not have a constitution like the United States has a constitution. So the United States, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. So if a law or anything contradicts the supreme law of the land, the Constitution, then the Supreme Court of the United States rules that it's unconstitutional, therefore struck down, right? But there's this document that they can look to and say and make arguments on. Here's what the document says, here's what it means, and here's the best interpretation of that. Here's what this law, what it means, the best interpretation of the law, and why it goes against the supreme law of the land, right? So that's what the Supreme Court does in the United States. Well, in Israel, because there is no constitution that is written down, it's kind of like in England where there's this system of common law. It's just these laws that have developed over time. In the case of Israel, it's these kind of essential laws, or these kind of like quasi-constitutional laws that have developed over time, and those are vague, much vaguer than a written constitution. And as a result, the Supreme Court of Israel has a kind of a tougher time to determine the constitutionality of a particular law, right? If it can't point to a constitution, how can it rule that something is unconstitutional? So as a result of that kind of ambiguity, the Supreme Court has, especially in the last few decades, got a lot of power for itself in Israel. Because there's no constitution to point back to, it really becomes whatever the judges or the justices believe is unconstitutional. So they have immense power. And then on top of that, the people who are on the Israel Supreme Court are basically all part of this like legal law board in Israel that appoints people to the Supreme Court, and it tends to be incredibly progressive. So all that's kind of the background, right? You have this very powerful Supreme Court, and you have Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, who wants to curb the power of the Supreme Court in Israel. So he's been proposing, and his ruling party has been proposing these new regulations, new measures to curb that influence. And this is originally what led to hundreds of thousands of people protesting in the streets of Israel. Well, on Monday, and then Netanyahu basically said, He withdrew the attempt to pass those measures and said, we'll take time, we'll let things simmer down, and then we may get back to them later. Well, on Monday, they kind of got back to those measures, and they passed, Israel's parliament, the Knesset, passed and approved a judicial overhaul in the face of these widespread protests, and even in the face of threats by military reservists, union leaders, and doctors to stop working in response to the policy. So what exactly does this measure do? How does it kind of limit the Supreme Court? So the law reduced the power of its Supreme Court judges or justices to overturn policies enacted by the legislator based on this vague standard of reasonableness. So the justices on the Israel Supreme Court could overturn a law if they deemed it unreasonable, right? But this unreasonable, it was never really defined what this reasonable standard was. And so this became kind of what the justices believed was bad for kind of the public good in general. If they believed it was bad for the public good in general, then they would strike down the law as unreasonable. So this, as you can see, gives the justices immense power, right? And instead of a legislative body with elected officials that can be voted out of office if they do something wrong, these justices can't. And so if they say that I don't like that law, so it's unreasonable, then that gives them immense power and no accountability, right? So you can kind of see why Netanyahu would want to curb the power of the Supreme Court. However, the fear here is that as the Supreme Court, as a legislator, kind of curbs the power of the Supreme Court, then really all that happens is the ruling party now has all that power, and they can basically do whatever they want. They can trample on individual rights. They can trample on minorities. They can trample on the freedoms and that people have and liberties. They can just do whatever they want because they don't have the Supreme Court there to check them, right? So there's this issue of checks and balances. Are they out of whack in Israel? And will they be out of whack as a result of this? So this is actually the law that was to get rid of this reasonable standard actually wasn't all that was included in the original proposal to curb the Supreme Court's power. It was just one part of it. And so the Knesset passed this law. It's a 120-seat Knesset, passed the measure by a vote of 64-0 after members walked out that opposed the measure. In response to this law being passed, doctor and medical workers went on strike to protest the passage of this first bill in kind of the series of proposed bills, and hundreds of thousands of people took the streets yet again. All of this goes to show you, I think, kind of the wonder, the superiority of the American system of government, right? That we have a checks and balances system, but those checks and balances system are written down in a constitution. We don't rely on these kind of common laws that have been passed down and that can kind of be changed just at the whim of a justice. We have a system that is written down that you can point to and say that's the law of the land, and you can argue about whether a law contradicts that or not. And the fact that we have, not just basically two branches of government, because Israel has a parliamentary system, so the legislator appoints the prime minister, and then you have the judicial branch. We have three separate branches of power, all that can check one another. And so what this leads to is the inability for one branch to assume all this power, right? In fact, when a branch does assume too much power, as we saw with the Supreme Court, I would argue in the 60s and the 70s, they had way too much power. The system, you can actually use the system to then correct that via appointing better justices that will that believe in the appropriate role of the judicial branch. Or the legislator, if they have too much power, then the Supreme Court can strike down laws that are unconstitutional. But this system is in place, written in a constitution in the United States that allows that to happen. Israel, that is not the case. Finally, there was a coup in the North African country of Niger. So on the evening of the 26th, there was a coup in Niger as a group of soldiers appeared on Niger's national television and said they, quote, had decided to put an end to the regime that you know, unquote. So the group closed the country's borders after they took power and imposed a nationwide curfew. So the president of Niger, Mohamed Bazoum, Mohamed Bazoum was elected 2 years ago in the country's first peaceful democratic transfer of power. And under Bazoum, Niger was seen as one of the only kind of last true allies in this region in the fight against jihadists linked to Al-Qaeda that have been making progress in the Sahel region, in particular in countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and parts of Niger. So I've talked about this over and over and over again. Right now in North Africa, in the Sahel region of North Africa, you have this massive expansion and momentum of Islamic terrorists, extremist Islamic terrorists, jihadists, taking and occupying areas. So think back to in 2014-15, ISIS and the expansion of ISIS in Syria. That's what you're kind of having, maybe not to that extent or that scale, in North Africa. And I've talked about how, because of this desire to expand, you have this massive conflict in the region, and that these groups thrive in instability. They thrive in desperation. And so you have this situation right now in North Africa, and now Niger has been kind of one of the only allies in the region working with the United States and other Western countries to push back and fight back against the jihadists in the region. And now that country has been overthrown due to a coup, that government. So that is obviously going to lead to more instability, which again increases the likelihood or the potential for groups like these to get a foothold in the region. And finally, there's also a power struggle between the West and Russia for influence in this region. So the Russian Wagner Group, if you remember, was kind of where the coup and attempted coup in Russia, the leader of the Wagner Group. The Wagner Group is actively involved in Africa. In fact, it's where it's kind of most actively involved is in the fight against terrorism in Africa. So what the goal there is you've got these countries that are desperate, these governments like the government of Burkina Faso or the government of Mali that are desperate to fight back against jihadists, but they don't have the capacity, and maybe they're not getting the help from the United States that they need, and so they turn to groups like the Wagner Group who don't have any respect for human rights. And that's an important point. It's like the West is a little bit limited in what we can and cannot do because we believe in human rights. We believe in making sure that before we kill people and we strike, that number one, we're not killing civilians, and number two, that we're for sure that person is a terrorist or did something wrong. The Wagner Group doesn't really care, so they can kind of just annihilate areas and annihilate groups and have no worry about constitutional rights. So they're actually effective against fighting groups like this, more effective potentially because they don't care about human decency and human rights. So the temptation for these governments, and the government of Mali has recently done this, is to turn to Wagner Group and say, hey, help us with this. And what that does is that gives Wagner Group and Russia more influence in that region. Now, the reason why this is particularly important in Niger is because Niger, if they're tempted to then turn to Wagner Group, it turns out that Niger is is a large producer of uranium, which the Wagner Group and Russia would then have more access and readily available access to the uranium in Niger. So this situation is volatile. It's not a good situation, obviously, for the people in Niger to experience this kind of instability. It's inevitably going to lead to some sort of suffering. So it's not good for the people in Niger, and it's also not good for the interests of the United States as they seek to fight back against Islamic terrorists. And the one ally in the region that they had helping them fight back has now been the victim of a coup, and as they look to continue to push back against the influence of Russia and the Wagner Group in the world, that has now been undermined by this potential coup in Niger. And with that is the end of the podcast this week. Please like, subscribe, share, do whatever you can to make it go far and wide, and I hope you will return next week.